This is John Amis talking about music from London. Today we devote our entire programme to the memory of the greatest Wagnerian soprano of our time, Kirsten Flagstad. During the next 30 minutes you will hear her voice both singing and speaking. To talk about her later life and recordings is John Culshaw, artist's manager for the Decca Company in Europe, for whom she made all her last records. Mr. Culshaw, when did Flagstad first enter your life?
1954 was the first time we met. It was when she had been in retirement for 2 or 3 years, and her friend Bernard Miles persuaded her to come out again and try to make some records. That was when it all started, and then she recorded pretty continuously from then until 1960.
Can you remember what was the first thing you...
Yes, the very first thing for our company was a trial series of Lieder records, and Lieder was never her particular strong point, but she felt that the sort of intimacy of a studio and simply a piano and no orchestra would be the best way back again. And indeed she did make 1 or 2 rather pleasant records of Brahms and Schumann and Grieg, especially Grieg.
You were in charge of the sessions, weren't you?
Yes, indeed.
What was your first impression then on meeting her for the very first time? Do you remember?
Well, it was rather terrifying because I'd seen her, as I'm sure you did, in all the Ring cycles and all the Tristans immediately after the war. And of course, being a great Wagnerite, she was a sort of idol, but I'd never met her. And suddenly to walk into a studio and be confronted by this rather large lady in a very splendid fur coat. But she was from the very beginning terribly friendly and terribly human. She once said to me in Vienna, when we first met, when we first worked together in London, I had the impression that you were scared of me. And I said, yes, you were dead right. I'd seen you too often in the second act of Götterdämmerung. Well, I suppose the idea that was foremost in my mind, and the mind of my colleagues in 1954 when we first began to work with her, was the idea of getting her to record as much Wagner as possible while her voice still prevailed. And she was very reticent at first, but we took a step. She agreed to make the Wesendonck Lieder in Vienna, and I think that began it. And the year after that, 1957, she made the third act of Walküre. We couldn't embark on a complete one because, quite frankly, there was no top C left. So the Hoyota Hose and so on in Act 2 were out. But she did, in fact, make a brilliant third act as Brunhilde, and then at her special request with a different conductor, and indeed in the next year she made Act 1 as Sieglinde, because she always loved Sieglinde very much. Then it went on to, of course, persuading her to do the Fricka in Rhinegold, which was the year after that, part which she'd never sung.
And how did she take to that?
Well, it took a long time to persuade her. First of all, she was rather shocked, I think, to be offered a tiny part, for it is a tiny part. I mean, Rhinegold plays 2 hours 20, and Fricka sings in all for about 8 minutes. And she said she would think about it, and she was rather flattered in a way, I suppose, but it's a come-down, you know, if you've done Brunhilde and Isolde. We tried all ways of persuading her. We told her the rest of the cast and that it was pretty star-studded all the way down and that she would just be one of a really great ensemble. This didn't seem to have much effect. And the whole thing was supposed to be a tremendous secret just between the two of us, but like all these secrets, it leaked out. And I had this wonderful letter from her about 3 months before the recording started, where she said, last week when I was in New York, I read in a paper that Mr. London was going to record Rhinegold as Wotan with me as Fricka. How can they make public such things before I've consented? Is it a way to force me to say yes? The part is very small, but quite good for me, I believe, but it's hardly worth the long journey to Vienna. But as I like so much to work with you and your friends, I will consent to do Fricka for you.
Very sweet letter, isn't it?
She had very wide tastes, too, outside Wagner. She adored a very beautiful collection we recorded with her of Sibelius songs, which she'd chosen herself with orchestrates. It was a glorious LP. They all lay comfortably within her range, and most of them hadn't been recorded before. They're all very, very beautiful, but one that's called in English Was It a Dream seems to me among the best of them.
So she made these records. What was she like at sessions? Was she...
Oh, very, very easygoing, very conscientious, very careful, and so, but she liked to be helped. She liked to be told what one thought was wrong. She welcomed criticism from almost anyone who had anything sensible to say. She was almost the easiest artist I've ever worked with in that sense. The only thing she could never stand was any sort of pomposity, people trying to score points off her or anything like that. But I mean,
did they?
Oh, occasionally people did. She was terribly sensitive, very, very sensitive about this whole unfortunate business during the war when she, perhaps I believe quite rightly, went back to Norway because she had a husband there. But of course, in certain quarters, since Norway was occupied, this was felt to be not quite the thing to do. And occasionally people would make rather indiscreet references to this. Perhaps not unkindly, but they would refer to it, and that sort of thing she took very badly indeed.
But was the matter ever brought out in the open? I mean, she was really very much maligned, wasn't she?
I believe she was terribly maligned because she simply went back. She was a very simple woman. She had no political affiliations whatsoever. And she went back to Norway simply because she had a husband and she loved him, and that was that. And she did not sing at all during those years.
And she got on well with all your recording boys, did she?
Yes, she did very well. Of course, we didn't work with her in the years before the war, naturally, when she really was, according to reports from America, a very, very temperamental prima donna indeed. It's simply hard for us to believe the stories one hears about her because during the years in Vienna, between 1957 and 1960, she couldn't possibly have been more benign. She was known to all of us as Mum, and she used to adore sort of parties and drinks and going out for dinner. She was a very good friend. One never had any difficulty in placing her in relation to the microphone. It was always a question of saying, well, this is where we would like you to stand, and indeed in the case of stereo recordings, which there all were, a move in the case of opera for the sake of the action. And if she had to move back, as she often did, well, she would just give more reserves of power. One didn't have to sort of open the microphone as she moved away because she just simply had it. It was extraordinary diaphragm and strength. The other thing was, the engineers demonstrated to me one day, she had an amazingly even voice. She once sang a scale for us from the A below middle C up to the A 2 octaves above that, at a certain strength. And the meter by which they measure the level of the recording never flickered at all. It just simply stayed constant. Now, this was a great revelation, I think, because you can take almost anybody else and get them to do the same thing, and you'll find there is what we call a peak in the voice, either a note which suddenly comes bursting through and vibrates the microphone, or a note or two that lack the power and intensity. But not with Flagstad. It was absolutely even all the way through. It's a remarkable organ.
People always used to say that really she wasn't very much of an actress.
No, I don't think she was, really. I think she had an amazing presence, don't you,
yes.
on the stage?
Yes.
A tremendously
utterly compelling.
Compelling presence.
Yes.
As an interpretive actress, no, I don't think she was. I mean, she tried very hard, and I think she understood Brunhilde, and I think she understood Sieglinde, not perhaps to the limits of interpretation, but she knew enough to make them very beautiful performances and artistically perceptive. She had a curious blank spot about Isolde, you know. She once told me that she had done, 160 performances of Isolde in her life, and she always loved the first act because she felt Isolde was a woman in the first act, when she was furious with Tristan, up to the point of the love potion. But after that, she had no time for her at all. And she used to, when she told this story, she used to flop back in her chair and put a sort of stupid expression, a gaga expression, I've to say, this is Isolde in the second and third act. So I have no time for her at all.
I think it was really a wonderful fortune that her voice, her personality, and the Wagnerian heroines, I mean the simpler ones, like Brunhilde, just happened to coincide.
Yes, I agree.
A sort of goddess-like creature.
Yes.
And this was the part that suited her best, really, that kind of person.
Yes, and I think by which she will really be remembered, you know. I think those are the things. It's a tragedy that she wasn't able to make a modern recording, a really satisfactory one, with a fine cast around her of Götterdämmerung, because somewhere along the line, somebody should have done it. But by the time she had this rebirth of a recording career, of course, it was really too late to tackle it.
But the Furtwängler Tristan is pretty terrific.
Oh, it is. It's magnificent. I mean, thank heaven we have that.
That was part of the first act of the Tristan that Flagstad and Furtwängler made together. Now, here's something rarer. It's a talk that Madame Flagstad gave for the BBC in 1950, and I believe it's the only talk of hers in English that still exists.
Many young people write to me for advice about singing Wagner. Some of them ask me if I will give them lessons. Others want to know how they can make a start, as if it were possible to start one's career with Wagnerian roles instead of ending with them. Now, I'm not a teacher, and I never wanted to be. I wasn't taught to explain, only to sing. But perhaps I can still give good advice about many matters connected with the singing of Wagner roles, and my first piece of advice to young and immature singers can be put into 3 words. Leave Wagner alone. Because he calls for powers which can only develop after many years of singing. I was already 34 years old and had been singing regularly for about 15 years before I attempted my first Wagnerian role, Elsa in Lohengrin. That is one of Wagner's lighter roles, but even so it calls for great vocal experience. For the real heavy parts, like Isolde and Brynhilde, you need even more. A perfectly placed voice, absolute control of the breath, and immense staying power. Many a promising beginner has come to grief for lack of these qualities. I had 3 teachers, the first when I was 16. The age when some of these youngsters who write to me would like to start singing Isolde, and they all taught me along the same lines. By that, I mean that I never had to go to a new teacher because I was dissatisfied with the one before. They simply took over from one another in a process of natural development. Therefore, I never had any real singing difficulties. I never had to unlearn anything. My voice simply grew. And it is this word grow which is most important of all. For the singer who wants to sing Wagner must be something like a weightlifter, building his muscles by slow degrees, adding gradually to the weights he lifts until he is able to attempt the very heaviest. Isolde and Brynhilde are the heaviest roles a singer can ever be called upon to sing, and if you ever wish to sing them, you must be prepared for many years of steady growing before you make the attempt. English and American audiences associate me almost entirely with Wagner, but I sang Nedda, Mimi, Tosca, Aida, Desdemona, Marguerite, Michaela, and many other roles, all before I ever sang a note of Wagner. I also sang in many operettas, such as The Dollar Princess, Gypsy Love, and Fledermaus, and these helped me to develop my acting and gave me a thorough understanding of stage business, a very necessary preparation for the heavier and more exacting work that was to come. And it was only after all this experience that I felt ready to sing Elsa, and later Isolde, my second Wagnerian role, and finally Brünnhilde. People sometimes ask how one memorizes such long parts as Isolde and Brünnhilde. Speaking for myself, I start by singing the part over at the piano, gradually forming my own ideas of what it is all about. Perhaps because my background was a very musical one, my father and mother were both professional musicians, it is the music which first fixes itself in my memory. Next come the words which require really hard work, especially as Wagner is nearly always sung in the original German, which is not my native language. Even now I sometimes make mistakes in the German words. Having got a pretty good idea of the words and music, I am now ready to work with a coach. This time it is he who sits at the piano and plays, while I stand and try to sing from memory. I give myself entirely into his professional hands, resting upon his knowledge and experience, until at last, after many months of hard work, I am ready for stage rehearsals with the producer and conductor. And so at last the curtain rises on the Isolde or Brünnhilde I've been striving to create. In connection with this, I might mention that I always sing with full voice at rehearsals, finding that this builds up my endurance, which is very necessary for long and heavy performances. But even now the work of learning does not cease. The interpretation of masterworks like those of Wagner, Goethe, and Shakespeare is a process of never-ending development. Always the role is beyond one's complete grasp. It is only possible to come a little nearer to it with each performance, but never to reach it. Always there are flashes of new inspiration, fresh subtleties, deeper meanings. That is what makes the work so endlessly absorbing. That is why one can never grow weary of it. The fact that singers has to perform the same works on different stages, in different costumes and settings, with different colleagues and under different conductors all over the world, also presents many problems. But the disadvantages involved are more than outweighed by the stimulus of meeting new audiences and of working in new surroundings. All my 3 teachers taught me to relax, always to try and keep calm. And I think I must be successful in this, for even if I sometimes feel very nervous, apparently I don't show it, for my colleagues nearly always come to me for confidence and assurance. I'm usually so relaxed before I go onto the stage or a concert platform that I find myself constantly yawning, and yawning is the most relaxed position of the throat and neck. I was taught from the very beginning always to sing with words, even in my exercises. That is to say, I was taught from the very beginning that the words and their meanings must be inseparable from the music. This is especially important in Wagner, which consists so much of long narrative passages where the singer is telling what has happened before in the story. When I had my audition at Bayreuth in 1932, I was told that I should have to improve my German diction. This Wagnerian diction consists in the strong explosion of the consonants, especially the end ones. I'm very shy about practicing, especially if I think anyone is listening. Once on the way to Australia, where I was to give some concerts, I was so conscious of the passengers in the cabins on either side of me that I practiced with my head out of the porthole, hoping that the sound of the sea would drown me. I practice very little before a performance, but I do always sing a certain phrase which I find very helpful. It is a beautiful passage from the Valkyrie. in which Brynhilde warns Sigmund he is to die. I was always taught that if the low voice is rightly placed, then the high voice will be in position too. And this is a phrase I use as my own little test piece. Nur totgeweihten, totgeweihten taugt mein Anblick, mein Anblick, wie mich erschaut, der scheidet vom Lebenslicht, vom Lebenslicht. Auf der Wahlstatt allein erschein ich edlen, edlen. Wer mich gewahrt, zur Wahl ich in mir. Here is a record of the scene in which this passage comes, with Seth Svanholm singing Sigmund.
That part of the Valkyries came at the end of a talk that Kirsten Flagstad recorded in 1950. And now I want to ask John Culshaw for a final reminiscence of the soprano.
Yes, well, this was in her last years. We had all sorts of plans. I felt it a sort of duty. I knew she was ill. I didn't believe she was as seriously ill, or didn't know she was quite as seriously ill as, in fact, she was. And she kept on writing that her great joy was music and so on. She used to play for herself so long as she could at the piano. And I used to send her lots of records, all sorts of things, doily cart operas and heaven knows what, which she used to enjoy. And also, to keep up her interest and perhaps confidence in herself, I used to send her all sorts of things with a view to recording them, things that were still within her range, the Brahms Alto Rhapsody, the 4 serious songs. What else? I even sent her the piece Sir Arthur Bliss wrote for Kathleen Ferrier before she died. Was it not called The Enchantress? Yes. which Ivan Newton told me Flagstad actually sang through with him at the piano once in Kristiansand, where she lived, a year or so before she died. And I kept on doing this, and she was very happy indeed with all this music and all these records, and really there was no indication until right at the very end that it was as fatal as it proved to be in December of 1962. And the first real indication I had was the last letter I had from her, which was on September 15th, 1962, when she said, "Thank you so much for the letters and records. As you see, I still want more. It's very difficult for me to write. I'm sick and cannot move easily. I've been in bed 4 months now. I've been at home 3 weeks and played records most of the time. I was delighted with the surprise ones, thank you. Gieden was glorious. The hymns of mine are quite good, and I'm glad you put them out. I think of you often and of the boys and our nice times together. Please send them my greetings. With love."
And that is the end of this Kirsten Flagstad number of Talking About Music. Besides Flagstad herself singing and talking, you also heard John Culshaw.